Dead Space 2 has absolutely no restraint. Part of what makes horror scary is the build-up to a scare, the quiet moments where nothing is happening, where the only thing you can hear is the soft ambience of the area. Everything is just dark enough that something could be lurking in the corner just out of sight, and you know something is there, you just don't know where. Dead Space 2 never gets to that point because it's constantly throwing enemies at you all the time to fill the dead space. The quietest section of the game is when you re-enter the Ishimura and you walk through the familiar hallways from the first game. Nothing happens for a while, there's no jump scares, there's no enemies, it's just the sound of the ship and the environment to take in. That was probably the best part of the game, because that's when Dead Space 2 really shines. It has great atmosphere and sound design, the smoke effects and lighting all still look really nice, and you have an established sense of what happened in this place previously, so you know that at any moment something could be waiting for you. And then they have a big necromorph just jump out from behind some crates, and the rest of the level is fighting wave after wave of necromorphs with barely any breaks, effectively killing all the momentum of the horror that they built up. That's the entire game. Dead Space 2 should have leaned more towards the horror elements they built up from the first game, but they decided to lean into the shooter aspects instead, so they just ended up with the worst of both worlds, a game that isn't scary, and a game with shitty shooting mechanics. It's also really, really loud because they decided that enemies screaming at you is scary. What's really scary is the fact that I had the game at 50% volume and it was still topping out the audio meter. It's no secret that Dead Space as a series was heavily inspired by Resident Evil 4. The biggest difference between the two, though, is that Resident Evil is a horror game first and a shooter second. You don't have to kill every enemy you come across. The game actively discourages you from doing so by only giving you so much ammo, only giving you so much space for the ammo, and allowing you to run past enemies if you're quick enough. You don't have that luxury in Dead Space. Every enemy that shows up you have to kill. Well, with one exception. Except Dead Space also decides to only give you so much ammo, which means fights are constantly frustrating when you run out of ammo and have to use the clunky gravity gun to grab parts of a body and throw them at enemies. It's also usually the best option because the limbs do a ton of damage. It's just not very smooth to use. I think Dead Space 2 would have been dramatically improved by giving you the option to move past enemies without fighting them, especially because the gunplay and movement mechanics really don't feel like they were designed for prolonged fights. Isaac runs like me, at a light jogging pace, no matter what the situation, which makes it extra goofy when there's a big hulking necromorph chasing him. Just take your time, Isaac, no rush. I want to explore the idea of being able to skip fighting enemies. I think if they decreased the amount of enemies in the game, decreased the amount of ammo you could have, and changed up the behaviors of the enemies just a little bit, then you could have a truly scary game. Shooting off limbs would be a strategic choice rather than something you have to do every single time you find an enemy. Maybe if you shot off the head, the necromorph would go into a blind rage. So you get that choice of, it won't be able to see me, but also it's going to be really erratic instead. You could even lean more into the gimmick of them being nearly unstoppable if you don't shoot off all their limbs to incapacitate them. You could waste ammo shooting off all the limbs to disable it completely, or you could just get the big limbs so you can run past and not have to waste a lot of ammo. While we were playing through the game, I suggested that the game could also incorporate an unlocked reticle, like they do in Resident Evil 4, where it floats freely across the screen to make aiming more difficult. But in retrospect, you might not need to go that far. The Resident Evil 2 and 3 remasters have a modern locked reticle and still play around the idea of not wanting to waste ammo just fine. Anyways, I'll come back from hypothetical land to talk about the story. It's not great. I don't think expanding on the stakes of the first game is really all that interesting, and maybe somewhat ironically, this was also the downfall of the Resident Evil series. What makes the stakes scary is that you're trapped in a place with monsters and you have to make it out alive. There might be an overarching goal to stop the evil from spreading from the place, but once the evil gets out, then it feels more like cleanup duty than actually scary. Also, they decided to give Isaac a voice and the personality of the most annoying person they could think of. The voice acting isn't bad, Gunnar Wright does a good job portraying Isaac, it's just that Isaac is written in a way that makes me want to punch him in the face. He's constantly making stupid decisions, overall seems very disinterested in what's going on despite stating his goals, and at worst comes off as a disaffected psychopath. They lean more into that last bit in Dead Space 3, so maybe that's actually what they were going for in 2, but the amount of scenes where Isaac yells frustratedly when he fails to save someone makes me think that he's still supposed to be empathetic towards other people. Also, the majority of this game is Isaac yelling frustratedly. It's very annoying. Anytime he gets jump scared by a necromorph, anytime something happens to someone else, he just shouts fuck. I get that he has a voice and a personality now, but leave the exclamations to the player. I shouldn't have to be told how to feel about a situation. I already touched on it briefly, but graphically, the game still looks pretty good. I don't think it's good enough to say that it holds up super well, especially in relation to the player models, but the dark atmosphere and smoke and lighting help to mask the low-quality textures and simple materials. Because the areas are smaller, there's also a lot of environmental design in each area, which works really well, especially when you use something like the force gun that knocks absolutely everything across the room. Feels really good to see a dynamic reaction from everything. That's something a lot of modern games still get wrong. Overall, though, I feel like the game has a lack of visual variety, especially because it's yet another brown shooter from the era where everything had a piss filter over it. It's not nearly that bad, but there's definitely a lot of similar color palettes across the game, despite visiting several unique locations. It all just blends together. It's no surprise to me that Dead Space 3 continued the trend that Dead Space 2 started by leaning more into the shooter aspects. Maybe if the Dead Space remaster is successful and we see a resurgence in the popularity of the series, they can make a Dead Space 2 and 3 remaster that's more in line with a horror game instead of leaning into the shooter part. Only time will tell. Oh hey, fun fact, Dead Space 3 was the very first real thoughts that I did for a game. It was short enough that I included it at the end of the summary instead of making it its own video. Would I recommend the Dead Space games? Yeah, sure. There's a reason why everyone recognizes the name. It's got a very distinct visual style to it. And a lot of people still do love the series, it's just not how I would have wanted it to go. Don't let my opinion stop you from enjoying something. Oh yeah, also fuck that final boss fight. I had only upgraded the plasma cutter because for the entire rest of the game it was the best gun for fighting enemies. So of course when the boss fight started I had no ammo for it and had to suffer through a bunch of base level weapons that weren't even the good ones, because I never thought to swap them out, which meant the boss fight was prolonged because I wasn't doing enough damage, and I would run out of ammo for every gun because I wasn't doing enough damage. It was fucking awful. Let me know what you think about my hypothetical, more horror-focused Dead Space ideas. I'm interested to see what other people think about the direction the series took, and whether you think that would improve the experience, or if that's not really what Dead Space means to you. As always, I'm sure there's more I could have talked about, particularly what I think about the level design, but I think that'll become more relevant when I talk about the first game, so I'll leave it for that.